Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Red Line Podcast latest Twitter event on Twitter Spaces. My name is Francis Leach, and it's my first event for 2023. So it's good to be back here as the head of breaking news at the Red Line Podcast as people start to filter into the space. And of course, don't forget that it will be available on our Red Line Podcast YouTube channel as well. After our conversation today, which will start in just a few moments. We're just allowing a few other people to filter into the room, into the space, and we will be underway. Our conversation today is focused around the turmoil and events in Brasilia, capital of Brazil, over the last 48 to 72 hours. In a sort of ghastly rerun of events of January the 6th in the United States 2 years ago. Once again, we've seen democracy come under enormous pressure as a consequence of a very fraught election, and one that was undermined by forces who have been questioning the legitimacy of elections and institutions in that country. And we've got two very esteemed people to help us discuss why it's happened in Brazil and what the consequences will be going forward for the country and for the region as well. Let's introduce our two speakers today in our Redline Podcast Twitter Spaces event. Dr. Christopher Sabatini is in London at Chatham House. He's a Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, the US and the Americas program there. Chris, welcome back to the Redline Podcast Twitter Spaces room. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you very much for having me, Francis.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your very valuable time, as is the case also for Bruna Santos as a senior advisor at the Brazil Institute. And I think she might be on the line from Brazil today. Bruna, welcome. How are you?
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Well, let's start with you, Bruna. Where are you? You're in Brazil at the moment. Which part of the country are you in?
Yes, I'm in Brasilia at the moment.
Okay, well, let's get a feel from you, who's being on the ground there. What's the atmosphere like there at the moment, and what have been the conversations you've been having with people in the Brazilian capital following what occurred there recently?
Well, I think, I think Brasilia was under attack on Sunday. So today the feeling is still like tension, a lot of tension on the streets. Yesterday, we saw Lula meeting with 27 governors around the country and the judges from the Supreme Court and presidents of the Congress. And they walked from the palace to the Supreme Court in a line of people just to demonstrate that they are facing the threats to democracy. I think that Sunday was chaotic in Brasilia. I think that the riots were really something that we saw it coming, but at the same time, for some reason, the government of the federal district and the law enforcement agencies could have stopped what happened, but yet they chose to turn a blind eye to the events that are definitely unacceptable.
I mean, Brazilia's Governor Ibanez Roca, who's been a long-time ally of former President Jair Bolsonaro, has been suspended for 90 days. The Security Secretary of Brasilia, Anderson Torres, has been dismissed as well. So these are immediate actions that have been taken to hold people to account for what was the calamitous failure of security around Brazil's capital.
Exactly. Well, Lula called on Sunday for what we call a federal intervention, because the policing in the capital is a responsibility of the federal district government. So Lula called for the federal intervention to control of policing in the capital, and actually accused in his speech the law enforcement of incompetence and bad faith. So the measure now removes authority from the governor, Ibanez Rocha, and his secretary of security, who was actually on vacation in Florida during the event.
Well,
that's a coincidence, right?
Yeah, just a coincidence. Well, Christopher, let's talk about that, because that's caused a very awkward moment for US President Joe Biden as well as Jair Bolsonaro, who basically took off to Florida in October following the election, has remained silent. His silence has been deafening in a sense in terms of his refusal to acknowledge his defeat and be part of a peaceful transfer of power. And the Americans are now talking about how they deal with this. Is there a role to actually hold him to account for what went on, or are they basically giving him a safe haven at the moment as his country is inflamed?
It's a good question, and obviously, the U.S. has been very quick to respond over democratic transgressions in other countries, applying sanctions, global Magnitsky sanctions, basically yanking the visas and freezing the bank accounts of corrupt officials and anti-democratic officials in Nicaragua, and Cuba, Venezuela. The question is, if they determine not just former President Bolsonaro, but others that may in fact be in the United States are guilty, or even in Brazil, should they apply the same sanctions to them for having stoked or even directly been involved in an insurrection. And I hope that's the case. Now, when it comes to Bolsonaro, we really don't know to what extent he was directly involved. He claims he wasn't, but he did denounce the violence and the destruction immediately afterwards. But as I like to say, you can't give the mobs the matches, give them the gasoline, and point them to the house, and then when the house burns down, claim, "Oh, I had nothing to do with the arson." So I think there has to be at least some recognition of his indirect, if not direct, but indirect responsibility for the tragedy that occurred and the attacks that occurred on Sunday. So if the Brazilians ask the United States to extradite Bolsonaro, I think they should consider it, and even at a minimum, maybe even consider possibly applying sanctions on Bolsonaro that would yank his visa to travel to the United States.
Bruna, back to you on this. The echoes of what happened in the United States in 2020, after the insurrection at the Capitol on January the 6th, are there for everybody to see. And it's also now coming to light that it was planned in Brasilia as well. I mean, we've seen evidence now that it was weeks in the making, well financed, and there were hundreds of buses that were paid for to organise Bolsonaro supporters to get to the capital. So it's hard not to believe that this, in many ways, was a rerun of what we saw in Washington 2 years ago, at least an attempt to try to do the same thing. And it was a deliberate attempt. It wasn't just an unorganised mob venting its anger.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, we saw, as I said before, we saw it coming, and there are two things. One, there was intelligence failure. I think, investigations will unfold to understand what exactly happened, that for some reason, they didn't act. The police at the federal district didn't act, and for why they did not or they did not get the reports from the Brazilian intelligence agency, ABIN, who had delivered reports to government. Also, I think there will be investigations also on the role of the Cabinet of National Security, who is no longer in charge of the security of the president's policy, but should be also following the news and the reports on intelligence about it. Also, I think there is one aspect of the events that are worth mentioning. As you said, there's no coincidence in politics, so we saw it coming. And Bolsonaro and his team had been closely studying the events of January 6th in the U.S. But there are, however, distinctions between both events. I think that the Capitol attack had the goal of obstructing Biden's swearing in, to impede that his victory becomes a foregone conclusion. In Brazil, on the other hand, it was January 8th, a Sunday afternoon. Nobody was in Brasilia. I mean, no one was attending meetings. The Congress was empty. The Supreme Court was empty. Declaration of results happened. Swearing in happened. Inauguration happened. So it implies, in my opinion, that the possibility of a coup succeeding at this point on January 8th is far remote. So what the strategy behind all the rioters seems to me that it was a demonstration of chaos, of the chaos they are capable to create, like breaking windows, breaking furniture, destroying artwork. It was very symbolic. So, yeah, the possibility of a coup happening actually was like have passed after all this. The time limit was over.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because just reading some of the reports, and I've been lucky enough to be in Brasilia and see this magnificent city. It is a sort of like a 1950s style futuristic vision of a modern progressive Brazil, and that magnificent buildings that are there that have Oscar Niemeyer's breathtaking curved creation that was climbed upon and defaced, and some of the nihilistic. Behavior within these protests speaks of something very different, as you say. It's almost a contempt for democracy without any, well, maybe there is a political aim long term down the track, but in that sense, it's just as frightening.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, like Brasilia, when Brasilia was built, it was built in the middle of nowhere, literally, and with an architecture that just makes things like really spread out, and it was really to avoid those kind of things to happen. The capital in Rio was totally different. It's a very dense city. Brasilia was built to have like those security measures better implemented.
Christopher, do we know much about the sort of the makeup or the composition of those that have supported Bolsonaro in his presidency? And of course, the election was very tight, as we know, and it's a community split down the middle along vastly different political lines. So, what is the composition of Bolsonaro's supporter base?
First, let me just turn to one thing that Bruna said. I think it's important to recognize is that it's been telegraphed for a long time. And there's a famous picture circulating on social media now of a cotton candy salesman in the midst of the crowds as they're storming the buildings. So you have this weird scenario where a cotton candy salesman had more awareness of the attack and was able to be better prepared for the carnival-like atmosphere that surrounded it than the federal district security services or police force. So clearly something is amiss in all of this. But what's also different about the attack on the 8th, it wasn't intended to disrupt the inauguration, but it was clearly, if you will, it was sort of an insurrection a la Latin American style, because it was calling for the military to intervene. So they weren't trying to disrupt an institutional process. They were just trying to call for an old-fashioned military coup. And that's troubling, because as Bruna was saying, there was a demonstration that this is going to continue. This is not a one-off event. And of course, they had already had encampments all over much of Brazil, so they're no longer there. But this can happen anytime. On Bolsonaro's coalition, first of all, he rode to power. He'd been a fringe, marginal congressman for a long time, although he likes to pretend he was an outsider. He had actually been in the parliament for a long time. He forged sort of this angry mob in Brazil that was upset over the corruption allegations that had followed the Lula government. Over primarily the three infrastructure companies, what's called the Lava Jato scandal, about $2 billion kickback scheme. Lula was ensnared in not directly that, but in another minor corruption scandal. So he really sort of captured this anger, and also sort of captured this, forged a new political coalition of the growing evangelical movement in Brazil, which is huge, just large mega churches, which are openly allied with and now openly campaign for Bolsonaro, with many of the sort of informal or even illegal farmers and loggers that are responsible for clearing out large parts of the Amazon, as well as what's sort of called the Bible, rather the bullets, the sort of growing sort of cowboy element in the west of Brazil that's more pro-gun. In fact, he actually, because of loosening gun restrictions, now 2 million Brazilians now have handguns, and this was a unique phenomenon that he was able to pull together, very similar to Trump in terms of its composition, very similar in terms of stoking the politics of grievance, this idea that politicians are all corrupt and it takes someone from the outside to shake it up, but also sort of presenting this very Manichaean good versus evil scenario. And he loves to portray basically Lula as being, and the PT, his party, as being these godless communists. They're not communists; they're a moderate left party that really sort of pitted the two sides in a very dangerous dialectic that we're facing now. And so for a lot of the supporters that stormed the buildings on Sunday, for them, this is a life or death matter. This is about the future of the country. It's about the future of their lifestyle. It's about sort of shutting down the woke environment. And it's very much of the, if you will, the sort of global right-wing movement that we see in places like Hungary, in the United States, and in other, even in Russia, to be quite frank. And that's very much what he's forged, and it's become a real force. And I think the first-round elections for the Congress demonstrated, and for the governorships, demonstrated that Bolsonaro is not just a passing phenomenon. His movement will be around for a while, unfortunately, perhaps.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere soon. So I want to ask you, Bruna, about the Brazilian armed forces. So back in April of 1964, there was a coup d'etat and a military dictatorship was installed. And there is a sense, in the older Brazilian generation, despite its history of torture and human rights abuses, of the so-called Brazilian miracle of the 1970s, when life was better for some, that a military dictatorship might be, the better outcome for those that support Bolsonaro. So where does the Brazilian military currently stand, and what's the sense of its status at the moment, given the tensions in the country?
Well, the military yesterday, the position from Hamilton Mourão, who is the former vice president and now elected to the Senate, is against saying that he's sorry for the events, that it is outrageous. So I would say the military elite is actually coordinated and to looking at the events as a crime, as the unrest that shouldn't be taken as something politically serious, but as something that is actually not, they were not a part of those riots. I don't know if you remember that, but right on January 1st, Mourão, who is the former vice president, came live.
Sounds like we might have just lost Bruna for a sec. Hopefully she'll be back again with us in a moment. I might just slip to Christopher for the time being on this issue and just ask you what you feel Brazil's military would be thinking at the moment in regards to its position, given the precarious nature of events there.
Like a Facebook relationship status, it's complicated. First of all,
a coherent of
according to what we know. Oh, she's back.
Bruna, we just lost you for a moment, so yeah, we'll see if she's still there.
The main message that we are receiving. There are, of course, names that were part of Bolsonaro's government that were talking and discussing possibilities of unrest with the people that were camping in Brasilia. But I don't think that's the big majority. Also, we're saying that the military is part of Lula's government. Lula, as we all know, is a very skilled politician, a very good coordinator. He probably had already discussed with the high level of the military institution to understand what are the stakes and bringing them on board in terms of addressing the next events. There are, of course, as we all know, a lot of nuances within the institution that we should pay attention, especially considering what we saw happening in the response at the federal district for the event. So the security forces will probably go through a scanning in terms of understanding who Lula can trust and who Lula cannot trust. Another thing I want to say is I do believe that one of the things that there is a mass delusion in that we should pay attention to. I think that whenever those events happen, we distance ourselves and go all those people are insane, they are criminals and everything. But I think that Brazilians, and especially scholars like us, we should pay a lot of attention to what actually represents Bolsonarismo and this movement of extremism, and what are their tactics and their strategy and how they are learning and how they're implementing it. I think we should take it a little more serious and understand the values behind it more in depth, and understand also where it comes from. It's a mass delusion. I mean, people are like kind of living in another world, but at the same time, they are armed, they are violent, and they attacked the Republic on Sunday. I think this is not something to just like look at them as criminals and they should be arrested and that's it. There are deep roots throughout the country that Bolsonarismo has created, and it goes far beyond the person Bolsonaro himself. I think that we should. It's very well coordinated to see such a movement happening without one single leader, right? It's like it's kind of it's something that we should definitely study more.
Yeah, well, I guess, if you think about it that way too, I mean, the Tea Party movement in the United States, Christopher, around 2009, 2010, was a leaderless movement that begat, I guess, the extremism in the United States Republican Party, which we saw play out in the recent speaker vote in the House of Representatives, and also, I guess, in the rise of Donald Trump and the undermining of democracy in that country as well. So these things have long antecedents, there's no doubt about it. But for Lula, his mandate will come from his ability to deliver economic progress for the vast majority of working Brazilians. And I'm really worried and interested to know your perspective on what the economic consequences will be for Brazil due to this instability, and what that means for Lula's bigger and wider agenda.
Well, first of all, let me just quickly go back and started on the issue of the military. And we don't, it seems that the upper brass of the military, of the armed forces, are institutionalist. We don't know lower level officers. There's allegations of a fair amount of sympathy for Bolsonarismo within those sectors. But the biggest problem, and this has always been a long-standing rumor, and it kind of played out, or conspiracy theory even, that the Bolsonaristas were going to try to stage rebellions in certain states, and sort of with the hope that the state police, the military police, which are controlled by the governors, would stand down and they would create chaos. Sort of what Bruna was saying earlier. And the hope was that this would drag the military into power, and eventually, the military would respond, if this should persist over time, would respond by simply calling for more stability and order. I don't want to be alarmist about this, but in my mind too, anytime the military is called out in the streets, even in the United States, to put something down, it can be, over the long term, it can be dangerous. And this gets to your point also about the United States, and clearly Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party. It's changed. We can sort of laugh him off. He was written off at first. And I think this is true also for Bolsonaro. And so, it's going to be interesting to see now how Lula attempts to address the very serious economic and social problems, now that he has to first address the issue of ensuring that there's no impunity for these egregious attacks on democracy in Brazil. And so he's going to have to, skate a very difficult line here, because first of all, he has to make sure that it doesn't look like judicial overreach. And we do have Manaus now sort of, being the lead figure in ways that, he needs to make sure that it's a judicial investigation that isn't just centered on one member of the Supreme Court. He also has to sort of look like, again, he doesn't play into this politics of grievance that the Bolsonaristas have, and the Bolsonaro and his clique and his sons try to stoke. But at the same time, this is going to be a huge distraction from the other real structural and economic and social that you mentioned, Francis, challenges the country faces. Economic growth is stagnating after it dipped. Obviously, during COVID, as all the economies did globally, started to grow back, but it's nowhere near it was when Lula was first in office from in the early 2000s. Second, poverty has increased. Lula in his first term had reduced the ranks of the poor by over 40 million people who joined a middle class, a fragile middle class, but a middle class. A lot of them now are slipping back into poverty. And of course, he has the twin challenges of inflation, which he's been able to tamp down a little bit thanks to continuing Bolsonaro's programs of basically effectively fuel subsidies, their reductions on taxes on fuel, which is reducing keeping the inflation rates below two digits. But by the same token, now he's also facing a huge fiscal overhang. and he had to sort of lift a fiscal ceiling. So he's got to deal with all these multiple challenges at the same time he has to confront his country's own political polarization. And getting back to the United States, we see this even just now with the recent rules that were passed by the Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, yesterday. They're already sort of attacking tax collection and doing all the things exactly that they shouldn't be doing. This is a Republican-driven initiative by the pro-Trump people of reducing fiscal collection in the United States. And this is the concern right now in Brazil is that this polarization may make it much more difficult to address very serious structural issues of tax reform, reduction of fiscal deficits, interest rates, and the like. And that's it's going to be a tough road for President Lula. Luckily, as Bruna said, he's a very skilled politician. So in that sense, we have someone who's in the Planalto who is probably at least has a good capacity in terms of his own personality and political skill to manage this.
Yes, he was a union organizer by trade, so he knows how to organize people. And we've seen Bruna on the streets of Sao Paulo. I just had a look before that there's been a massive demonstration in support of Lula's government and condemning the rioters in Brasilia. So there is a sense of a rearguard action from ordinary Brazilians who are supporters of Lula and of democracy to get out on the street and actually raise their voice as well in support of a government that they feel is under siege before it even begins governing.
Yeah, well, they called, a number of movements, social movements, and also people who had already, during the election, positioned and, made manifestos defending democracy. They were all, calling for peaceful manifestations around the country. I think the mainstream media, the mainstream politicians, even people that have honestly, they didn't like Lula, so they voted for Bolsonaro. They were making statements against what happened and saying that how they do not support it, the whole left right wing that it's more in the center in terms of they defend the liberal in economy, but they are more conservatives. I think they were very clear on how they think the events were outrageous. There's only one thing I want to follow up on what Christopher was saying. The legislative agenda for Lula was really clear that priority number 1, 2, and 3 was passing the tax reform. The Congress is in recess, but now today they are going back to work because of the events in an extraordinary session. So we should definitely, as Christopher was saying, see how these events and the need for the extreme polarization and the need for institutional normalization throughout the country will or will not affect the levers that Lula had played to pass his most important and urgent bills and reforms. Concerning not only the tax reform but also other legislations that he wanted to pass. One is, for example, the regulation of the internet, which was also a priority for him and his office. So we should follow that closely.
Christopher, let's zoom out a little bit and have a think about the strategic implications, the wider strategic implications of Brazil being, destabilized like this. And Brazil has one of the biggest economies in the world, and is a very important strategic player within the Western Hemisphere, and a really important player in South America and American strategic ally. So, what is the wider world seeing or thinking about what's going on in Brazil and its strategic implications?
I think as depressing, at least shocking as the events on Sunday were, one positive note was the unanimity globally in supporting Lula and democratic institutions and supporting the right of Brazilians to choose their elected leaders. That was very positive, from Biden to AMLO to China. To Rishi Sunak here in the UK, all condemned the coup, and I think that's very positive. And I think in some ways, as Bruna was saying too, on the legislative agenda, the wind is somewhat at Lula's back right now. Internationally, certainly there's support for this. I would like to think, even in terms of Brazil's sort of search for international investment and the like, that this will also help. I don't think most people will look at this and think, oh, this is an unstable environment to invest in. I think most people see Brazil as having many resources and advantages in terms of investment and economic growth, around energy, around innovation, and the like. So I think in many cases, it's in a good position. And I think it will also in some ways strengthen in Brazil. The Lula administration under Celso Amorim and Antonio Patriota and the members of his foreign policy team were very embedded and tried to leverage multilateral institutions to further Brazil's global role. And it also tried to, they also increased global trade with Africa and the Middle East, try to assert themselves in diplomatic fora. I think this will actually benefit them in many ways. I think they have, again, the sympathy of the multilateral institutions, who will now embrace them and try to strengthen their role so as to give them a certain buffer against domestic pressures that I think would be helpful. Again, I think as much as we worry about this tide of right-wing populism, whether in Turkey, even Israel, quite frankly, Hungary, we worry about this, but the truth is, I think the world is kind of waking up, and Russia as well. The world is kind of waking up to it in a way that I think we're going to start to see a greater effort to cultivate alliances among democratic countries to strengthen multilateral institutions, to speak out against democratic transgressions, that will benefit countries like Brazil. And Brazil can, as it had been before, become much more of a leader particularly in the global South, but in broader international fora on behalf of the global South. So I think, I don't want to be too much of a Pollyanna or too much of an optimist on this, but I think in some ways I would never say that this tragedy has helped Lula, but I think it does in some ways. It's not an entirely negative scenario for public perceptions of his government and the political stability of Brazil.
And just to finish, Bruna, do you share that optimism?
Well, there's no way to share optimism. I wouldn't use this word today.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But definitely we don't get bored in Brazil. But anyway, I think that I think it's fair to say, and besides the general international opinion, even locally, if you look at more more moderate opponents, if you look at, as I said, the mainstream, the ones in the center, like governor of Minas Gerais, even the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, who had never stated support clearly to Lula, they are likely to reduce their reproofs so that they are not associated with what happened. So I think that he has a chance now to put down a radical opposition, to respond well to this crisis, and to gain more nationwide approval, because the Bolsonaristas and Bolsonaro himself have actually helped Lula in the past. I mean, I always say that the person who never stopped talking about Lula was Bolsonaro throughout his whole mandate. He was always talking about Lula and fighting Lula as the enemy. So he kept Lula alive in everyone's mind while he was arrested. He was in jail. And now I think that somehow it may help Lula on selling his leadership and positioning himself internationally. It's really hard to say. As Christopher was just saying, I feel extremely cold and pragmatic by saying that, but honestly, that's the truth. And we all know that Lula is a smart politician who will probably somehow use that as a lever, as he should.
Let me just actually quickly add to Bruna's comment, because I agree. Lula's always been a rock star internationally. He's always been received with sort of a rock star's welcome. And I can guarantee when he travels again to Europe or to the United States, they're going to really roll out the red carpet to send a very strong message to, hopefully even the moderate politicians, even some who skewed towards Bolsonarismo within the political class, that he enjoys, or that democracy and legitimately elected president enjoys international support. And that's no small thing.
Yes, I think that's very true, Christopher and Bruna. It also flows off the back of President Volodymyr Zelensky's conduct of Ukraine's defense against the Russian invasion, and that democracy being under threat. These things are these wars or these battles now are joining hands, and people can identify the risks involved. Look, I thank you so much for being involved in our conversation tonight, Dr. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America and US and the Americas program at Chatham House. And also, Bruna, thank you also for being with us as well. Bruna Santos, who's from the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. I really appreciate your time today for this important conversation, Bruna.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Christopher.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Thank you to everyone.